learned last week was 5 basic principles. We said there's going to be a 6th, so that's coming in a later class, but 5 basic principles that kind of provide the structure for how to analyze these hard parts in the Bible. And what we're going to do over the next 3 weeks especially is we're going to take a look at some specific issues, frankly, probably the top 3 objections, categories of objections that people have or difficulties people have with Bible passages. And we're going to apply some of those basic principles and see how they can help us work through some of these issues so that later on, if you come across other passages that we don't go over in this class, then you'll have the tools in order to do so. Those 3 issues, obviously, tonight we're going to be focusing on, does God condone slavery? Next week it's going to be the question of genocide, and then the 3rd week it's going to be gender equality. People say that the Bible is sexist, and we're going to explore that as well. So without further ado, quick review as far as what we did last week. Last week, as I said, we talked about 5 basic principles to help us keep in mind to help us work through these hard parts of the Bible. The first one was more of a general, just something generally to keep in mind, and that was even labeling an act as immoral in the first place requires God to be the source of all that is good, and that's where we talked about what even is morality? What makes something moral or immoral? Well, you actually need God in the picture in order for those terms to even make sense in the first place. So theoretically, the answer to all of these questions could be, well, if God said it, by definition, it has to be the morally right thing to do, because you can't even question something morality without first invoking God, whether you realize it or not in the first place. But we also talked about, as a practical matter, that's not going to convince too many people, and it gets into the head versus the heart. That may be the right answer to the question up here, but we still want to address it here in what we feel, which is where we went into the next few principles. Number 2, just because the Bible records an action does not mean God has condoned that action. The Bible is filled with stories of imperfect people doing imperfect things, and the mere fact that it says describes an event happening doesn't mean God approved it. We need to read carefully to look to see if there's any indication that God actually approved that action. Number 3, and this is one we're going to focus a lot on tonight, always make sure we take in the entire surrounding textual context before coming to a conclusion. A lot of times when people raise these objections or we come across a difficult passage, it's because we're reading that passage in isolation. We're not reading what comes before it. We're not reading what comes after it. We're not reading, if it's we talked about if it's about a particular character. The example we used last week was for Abraham. Well, you got to know a little bit more. What do we know about Abraham's story leading up to that event? What happened in even the chapters beforehand. So you have to understand the full surrounding context, textual context. Number 4, there are principles reserved to God by nature of him being God. Remember, this is the example we gave where a judge has the authority to lock someone up in prison if they want to as punishment for a crime that they've committed. A private citizen does not have that right. It would be kidnapping and wrongful imprisonment. So there are certain, you're laughing at that. You just, am I hitting home or something? Okay, I don't know if I want to know the answer to that. We could talk later. No, but seriously, there are some, by nature of the person being a judge, there are certain rights and privileges that they have that other people do not. If that's going to apply to God, or to a judge, a human judge is clearly going to apply to God. And number 5, the 5th basic principle that we talked about last week that we use to analyze these things, and like I said, this is another one that we're really going to focus on a lot tonight, is sometimes our failure to understand a difficult passage is because we're missing some nuance from the original language or from the historical and cultural context in which the action takes place. You're going to see, like I said, a lot of what we're going to work through tonight in regard to the slavery issue is really going to focus on number 3 and number 5. And I mean, we're not going to be subtle about it. I'm going to put them up on the screen when we're talking about something that principle applies to, okay? So let's see how some of this works out, okay? Now, the first thing, if you have the book, you want to follow along in the book, this starts on page 19. Again, for those of you that are new, I apologize. There is no large print edition. The large print edition is to pull out your cheaters, like I have to, But it starts there on page 19 with a quote from Sam Harris. Sam Harris is an atheist, and he wrote a relatively short book called Letter to a Christian Nation, where he claimed to be essentially writing a very conversational letter to Christians to try to convince them of the error of their ways. Ravi Zacharias is a Christian apologist. I don't know how many of you are familiar with him. He actually wrote a very good rebuttal to Sam Harris. I might be getting the name wrong. The End of Reason? He definitely has a book called that. Whether that's the one that actually responds to Sam Harris or not, I'm not sure. But he did write a rebuttal to Sam Harris because the book itself, to be honest with you, is not... I want to be fair because it really wasn't intended to be like something scholarly work. It was intended to be more of a conversational tone. but the philosophical level of philosophical thinking is not very advanced. But here's one of the things he said in there. He said, consult the Bible, and you will discover that the creator of the universe clearly expects us to keep slaves. So understand what this is getting at, all right? Remember what we talked about with even those basic principles before, that just because the Bible reports something doesn't necessarily mean God condones it. So in order to evaluate whether Mr. Harris is correct in his claim or not, we have to be asking, are there things in the Bible that show that God actually explicitly condoned it? It's not just reporting this is going on. It's not even just that God is allowing it to happen, which is a distinction we'll get into in tonight's class, but that God is specifically putting his seal of approval on the practice. So we're going to look at that in more detail here tonight. Like always, when we're dealing with these hard parts, we want to start off, we want to be as open and honest and just put it right out there. We're not going to sugarcoat anything. So we're going to start with one of the most difficult passages. We're going to talk about it a little bit, and we're actually going to come back to it later in the class, but this is a passage that really kind of disturbs a lot of people when they come across it. All right? And this is from the book of Exodus, chapter 21, verses 20 and 21, and I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. You might, if you're a good detective, you might notice that all the Bible verses so far that we did last week were in the New International Version, and I specifically changed it for this, but I won't tell you why until later. You're going to have to hang around for that. But this is the New Revised Standard Version, which is usually the version that people use when they are finding this problematic. And here's what it says. It says, when a slave owner strikes a male or female slave with a rod, and the slave dies immediately, the owner shall be punished. But if the slave survives a day or two, there is no punishment, for the slave is the owner's property. You can see where that's a passage that a lot of people are going to pull out and say, well, there you go. I mean, clearly God's condoning slavery, right? So let me just open the floor to start this, kind of like we did last week. I want to open the floor up to kind of get what your initial impressions are. Let's be honest about it, all right? When you read that passage, what do you think it says about slavery? Just on a surface reading. Call them property. Anything else? I'm sorry? It doesn't necessarily say he allowed it. He's establishing some punishments in the event something happens. But you're right, if you look very carefully, nowhere here does it actually say, by the way, I think slavery is a good thing. It just says, within the confines of this institution of slavery, if these things happen, then here's what should be done about them. But I think, and honestly, the biggest issue a lot of people have here is twofold. Number one, if you look at the first part of that, it basically says, well, if the slave dies immediately, the owner shall be punished. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean we have some institution where it's like, okay, your slave died, all right, give me a penny and go on your way, you know? And then the second part is, but hey, owner, if you can beat your slave to an inch of their life, and as long as you can keep them alive for a couple of days, if they die on day 3, you're scot-free. But as long as you can keep them alive for those first few days, you're all right. Just don't let them die right away. All right? I mean, that's certainly, and then of course there's the property issue as well that we all already picked up on. Those are probably the 3 things that when people read this passage really start to disturb them, the questions they really ask. So we're going to have to go through all of those, and we will, but not yet. Because the first mistake a lot of people make when they are looking at the issue of slavery in the Bible is they don't understand the nature of slavery in ancient Israel. All right? So let me ask this question first to the floor. What do you think of somebody, when you hear the word slavery, all right, tell me what that makes you think of. Define slavery for me. I'm sorry? In bondage? Oppression? Anybody else? I'm sorry? Civil War certainly makes you think of that. Yeah, and that's key, all right? Because, like it or not, we all have to be aware of what baggage we bring, all right? I just did an episode, for those of you that watch, we have a week, or else bi-weekly now, every other week we have a talk show, Trinity Talk Live. And that new episode went up today, and it's Pastor Jay and I, and we were talking about the issue of, there's a disagreement among Christian churches about whether you should do things like allow American flags in the sanctuary. Some Christians say, no, you should not have any symbols of the world. The whole point of a sanctuary is to get away from the world, so you shouldn't even have those in there. And others think that it's okay. And one of the points that I made, after, he and I kind of agreed on where we come from on it. I'm not going to spoil it. You have to watch the episode if you want to see it. But one of the points I made at the very end is, look, we have to be aware of our own biases, and I'm fully willing to admit that I'm an Air Force brat. All right? I grew up with my dad. He retired lieutenant colonel, United States Air Force, served in Vietnam as a B-52 bomber pilot. I grew up, my childhood was going from Air Force Base to Air Force Base. And Pastor Jay, his whole family's military, just about him. His son, his father, I think, there's another brother, as I recall. And so we both admitted that, okay, we've got to admit what our own biases are. Is this potentially influencing our opinion? It may be. All right? The same thing is true here in slavery. We all in America have a concept of what that means because of antebellum slavery and the Civil War and all that and what we experienced. So naturally, when we read the word slavery, we're going to bring those presuppositions and those biases into it. And what we need to be very careful about is, wait a minute, is slavery, the slavery as we remember it in American history, is that really the same institution as what was going on in ancient Israel? All right? And you need to do a little bit of historical study. And last week I mentioned getting a good study Bible or even a good Bible commentary can help you sort some of these things out. So, in ancient Israel, there's some disagreement among scholars about exactly how to break down the categories, but essentially there were three different types of slavery. All right? The first one are what are called debt slaves. All right? Debt slaves are essentially people who sold themselves into slavery for economic reasons, all right? This actually was more of a form of indentured servitude, all right? What it is if you were poor and you could not provide, you had so much debt, whatever, you could no longer afford to provide for yourself and your family, then you could sell yourself to someone else to basically be their servant. All right, and we'll see how that played out in a little bit as we start walking through the biblical provisions. It wasn't an indefinite, necessarily an indefinite status. Now, what we call the master, the person you sold yourself to, then had obligations to you and to your family. All right, they had to provide you food, they had to provide you shelter, all of those things that you couldn't afford for yourself. The master now had to provide. Now keep in mind, none of this is ordained by God. You're not going to find a biblical passage that says, thou shalt have debt slaves and chattel slaves and forced slaves. It's not in there. All right. What I'm telling you is this is what was going on culturally at the time that God was dealing with. All right. This was their welfare system. Just like we have legal provisions today for how to take care of the poor, this is what they did. All right. You may not like it, but that's what was going on here. All right. The second type of slave is chattel slaves. And this is, we're getting more similar, but still not identical to what we would think of as slavery. Chattel slavery was when someone would be purchased and put into servitude. The same obligations on the case of the master still applied, where they would have to provide for those people and their families. And also, this was actually something, it wasn't as common as debt slavery. And chattel slavery also was something, believe it or not, that people might put themselves into voluntarily. Now, you might be asking, why would someone put themselves into chattel slavery voluntarily in that culture? Well, the reason is this. Let's suppose that you had a particularly wealthy individual, obviously it'd have to be if they're affording to buy slaves in the first place, but they have no heir, or no male heir, as the case may be. All right. It was not an uncommon practice at all that someone may actually leave their estate to a beloved slave if they didn't have an actual family heir. And so what would happen, very similar to debt slavery, if they were destitute, they couldn't afford to provide for themselves, they might find someone who was wealthy and didn't have an heir and say, I'll be your slave. And then what happens, what they're hoping, of course, and there's no guarantee, but what they're hoping is that when that master passes away, they're going to leave their estate to that slave and get them out of slavery. All right? And the third type of slavery was what's called forced slaves. This is where you're conscripted by the government. The classic example is prisoners of war. All right? This is not a category that would typically apply to Hebrews, because typically what a forced slave is, at least in theory, was if you go to war and somebody, war criminals, whatever, just like we have, sentences, we have incarceration, punishments, things like that for war criminals today, Back then, they didn't have big, giant, huge prison system like we have today. Their punishment for foreign war criminals, so to speak, prisoners of war, whatever, was slavery, all right, where they would have to work for the state. So lots of times forced slave would be used for like construction projects, things like that. Herod's temple is a classic example of something that would have been built through this type of slavery. All right. So understand that that's a general outline of what the three types of slavery were, but none of the categories were based upon race or anything like that. At no point was there, you belong to this particular race, therefore you are inferior to everybody else. All right. That's what was socially going on, all right? Now we got to look at the scriptures and see, does God ever approve even of this? Even of this structure, does God ever say, yeah, this is good, let's go with that, all right? All right, before we do that, that's kind of what was going on in Israel. I want to give a really brief comparison with what was going on in the surrounding nations, all right? Slavery in the nations surrounding Israel, as you'll be able to see right off the bat, and as you'll definitely be able to see as we work through what God actually had to say about it, was a very different institution. All right. For example, in the Middle Assyrian laws, in the Code of Hammurabi, those both authorized a master to cut off the ear of a slave as a punishment for the slave's disobedience. All right. The laws of Ashnuna, actually, they illustrate something very interesting. The other surrounding nations would sometimes have punishments for abusing a slave or doing something wrong to a slave, but the punishments were never really to benefit the slave themselves. They were to benefit the slave's owner. All right. So in this case, what we see is an example that if you killed someone's slave, then you had to give them 2 slaves of yours. All right. And so the mentality, if you look at behind the laws in the surrounding nations, was always that if something bad happened to a slave, the wrong that was done to the owner, not to the person that was the slave themselves. All right? We're going to see something very, very different as we work through the way that God handled it. All right. That's kind of our cultural context so far. Does anybody have any questions about that? It's a real quick overview, I know, but about kind of what it looked like at the time, what it looked like in the surrounding nations. All right. Now, let's ask a few questions here, and then we're going to dive into the more Bible study portion of it. Given this cultural backdrop, both in Israel and the surrounding nations, what do you think the reaction would have been if God had just come out and said, bring all forms of slavery to an immediate and screeching halt? Chaos? Anybody else? The poor wouldn't survive? That's a big one. I'm sorry? Things wouldn't get done. I see one of 2 possibilities here. One, God just wouldn't have been listened to. All right? And I think that's probably, if we look at the history of Israel, all right, is Israel really known for, shall we say, diligently and perfectly obeying everything God commanded them to do? No. All right? So I think when you've got a culture that this institution is so deeply embedded, all right, all odds are if God came down and said, don't do it, nothing would have changed. Nothing would have changed. All right? How do you, I can't remember what my next slide is here. Yeah, we'll get to that in a minute. All right. If you want to, let's say that, I hate to say this word, let's play God, all right? You're God. You look down and you see these deeply embedded cultural norms, all right? You don't like them. What do you do? What do you think is the best route you could take to change them? If you know a fiat's not going to work, you can't. If you just come down and say, don't do it, nobody's going to listen to you, all right? And even if they did, like we said, we've got no alternative method in place to care for the poor. What's going to happen to them? But odds are they're not going to listen to you in the first place. So what do? How do you handle it? Yeah, something incremental. And here's the thing. God has to respect people's free will, but what he really wants here is he doesn't want people just not doing it just because he says don't do it. He wants to change people's hearts. He wants to make people realize that this institution is wrong. all right, that everyone that he created is equal in his eyes. Everyone is worthy of dignity, all right? You don't do that by order. You don't do that by fiat. You do that by changing hearts. And the way you change hearts is incrementally, all right? So some people might object if they hear me say this, and they say, I use the phrase in the book, God's playing the long game. And some people may object that that's a cop-out. Come on, Ken, you're just trying to make excuses for God not explicitly saying that that slavery is just flat out wrong, stop doing it now. All right. So the question that when people say that I'm just doing what's called an ad hoc explanation, where I'm just making this up, there's no biblical support for it. It's just a convenient response because it fits whatever desired conclusion I want there to be. The question then becomes: do we ever see any other instances in Scripture where this is God's modus operandi, where this is what God is doing? Take a look at Matthew chapter 19, verses 8 and 9. It's not in the book. It's referenced at the very last paragraph of the chapter, but I decided to move it up for tonight. All right? It's on the screen. If you want to read it up there, you can open up your Bibles. And let's talk about this one for a little bit. Matthew 19, verses 8 and 9. And to give my voice a momentary rest, I'm going to ask for a volunteer, if someone wouldn't mind reading that passage, again, either from the screen or from your own Bible.
Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that everyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery.
All right. So let's look at that passage. And there's some disagreement, obviously, within the Christian church as far as, obviously, there's some circumstances where God does allow divorce. Obviously, we know that. But as a general principle, does God like it or not like it? Doesn't like it. In the Old Testament, did God allow it or not allow it? What's that say? He allowed it, right? Why? Why did he say he allowed it? Their hearts were hard, right? The exact same thing I'm kind of making the sales pitch for in regard to the issue for slavery is exactly what we see in this passage in Matthew. That God is saying, in the Old Testament, there were things that he permitted to keep going because the hearts of the people were hard. They weren't ready for it yet, all right? But it wasn't always that way, all right? That's not ultimately what God's desire is. He wanted to move people in a certain direction, all right? This is what I'm talking about. So if you don't understand what I mean by God playing the long game, this is it. All right? Certain things he tolerated, they were there culturally, he allowed them to stay, but as we're going to see, he imposes some regulations on them to try to play that long game so that in the end, people start listening and taking to heart what he's saying. They're going to start realizing, and slowly but surely, change of the heart is going to happen. And change of the heart is going to be a lot more long-lasting. Anybody that knows anything about, the way humans work is that if you force someone to do something, all right, the moment they are not under that your foot anymore, they're going to go right back and do it again. If you don't believe me, have a teenager. All right. I love you, honey, if you're watching. So she's not here tonight. So, but seriously, that oppression, force doesn't enact long-lasting change. It only works so long as that force continues to be in place. All right. If you want to make long-lasting change, you need to change people internally, and that's what God's trying to do here. All right. So we are now going to take a look at some Bible passages specifically in regard to slavery. And let's start out with Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 12 through 15. If you're looking at the book, this is on page 22 of the book. As I said, or you can read it out of your own Bible. But if I get a volunteer to read that, what we're talking about, well, I won't tell you what we're talking about here. Let's read the passage first, and then we'll ask some questions about it.
A fellow Hebrew, a man or a woman, sells himself to you and serves you 6 years. In the 7th year, you must let him free. And when you release him, do not send him away empty-handed. Supply him liberally from your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress. Give to him as the Lord your God has blessed you. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. That is why I give you this command today.
All right. Let's break this down a little bit, all right? So we're starting to see, this is kind of our first example of what God had to say about slavery. First thing, all right, let's take the obvious one. Every 7 years, what was supposed to happen? I'm sorry? Set them free, right? What else? Provide for them. Do you start to see how this whole thing was kind of designed to help care for the poor? The whole idea is here, first of all, you set after on that 7th year, so they serve you for 6, that 7th year they got to be set free, but it's not just setting them free. It's providing for them so that hopefully they won't get back in this position again. All right? The idea here is to break the cycle. So God's looking at this institution that they have going on culturally, and he's coming up with a way to break the cycle right off the bat. All right? Now, does this say that it only applies to any particular category of those slaves that we just talked about? Debt slaves, chattel slaves, forced slaves, does it say? It doesn't specifically confine itself. Now, as a practical matter, we'll see it probably didn't apply, at least in principle, to forced slaves too much for a very practical reason. Who does it apply to? I'm sorry? It could apply to chattel slaves, as long as they're what? Hebrews, right? It only applies to Hebrews. So this does not apply to foreigners, which we'll get to in a minute, all right? So this is talking about if you have a fellow Hebrew who is your slave, and it could be a chattel slave, it could be a debt slave. Like I said, probably not as likely to be a forced slave, because that was mostly prisoners of war and things like that. But in theory, if that did come about, then this would apply to them too. It doesn't matter. If they're Hebrew, then they get freed in that 7th year. Ta-da. And you provide for them, so hopefully they're out of the cycle of slavery for good. All right? Now, look at the rationale. What rationale does God give here for requiring their release after 6 years? Toward the end of the passage. That they were, remember, you were slaves in Egypt yourself, and I redeemed you. Now, so the idea is, look, if I freed you, then you should be letting them go free as well. Can you think of, just brainstorming here, anything else that rationale might apply to? In other words, if you were an Israelite or a Hebrew enslaved in Egypt, what would you have wanted? How would you have wanted to be treated? I'm hearing a lot of... With compassion? Yeah. So if we see this rationale where God's saying, remember that you were slaves too at one point. Oh, by the way, as we'll see when we get to foreigners, you were slaves in a foreign land, all right? Then anything that you would have wanted, any way you would have wanted to be treated, shouldn't that carry over in the way you treat other people? I don't know. I'm just going to make something up off the top of my head. Something like do unto others. What's the phrase? Yeah, okay. You start to see it right there, don't you? All right. In the. Mm-hmm.
And the people who came back that they needed were treating the poor people like that. And you might just be that's not right. You got to treat the people in you got to treat them right. And they did.
It doesn't say something about human nature. I mean, it's sad, but we could probably go through history and find all sorts of examples where someone who's been on the receiving end of negative treatment, then all of a sudden their tables turn and they become the one in power and they kind of forget where they came from, you know. So this is a reminder for all of us, not just in this context, you know, that especially, you know, if you've accepted Jesus Christ, your Lord and Savior, one thing you've had to come to terms with is that you're a sinner. You're not perfect, all right? And that should put a certain sense of humility in all of us, all right? Especially when we're treating with, you know, we're dealing with other people, you're dealing with that person that just cut you off on the highway. I'm not speaking from personal experience whatsoever, no. You know, or more recently, you're dealing with that person who's driving really slowly on the highway, you're in a rush. No, the speed limit's 65, why are we doing 40, all right? Okay, well, what really should be going through our head in that instance is why are they going 40? You know, what's going on there? You know, and I've been there. You know, there was one time I had a flat tire, I drove on a donut, and I wasn't allowed to go over 45, you know, and I had the distance from home, I had to get home. So that should always bring a little amount of humility, and this is another reminder of that. You know, remember where you came from. All right. Moving on, we are now on page 23 of the book, and this is Leviticus. I'll read this one just out of the book here because we kind of skip around a little bit in the verses. It's because it's really a much longer passage, but we're reading Leviticus chapter 25, verses 8 through 10 and 39 through 43, and here's what it says. Count off 7 Sabbath years, 7 times 7 years, so that the 7 Sabbath years amount to a period of 49 years. Then have the trumpet sounded everywhere on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the Day of Atonement, sound the trumpet throughout your land. Consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each of you is to return to your family property and to your own clan. If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to you, do not make them work as slaves. They are to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you. They are to work for you until the year of Jubilee. Then they and their children are to be released, and they will go back to their own clans and to the property of their ancestors. Because the Israelites are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt, they must not be sold as slaves. Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God. All right. Again, should be an obvious question. What happens every 50 years? Everybody's turned free again, right? So what that means, even if this falls in year 3 out of that 7-year period we just read in the last passage, guess what? They still get set free, all right? So God has put 2 provisions in place for freedom of slaves, but again, what kind of slaves are we talking about here? What do they have to be? Hebrews, all right? That's all we've looked at so far. So your fellow Israelites, so to speak, are going to be freed. If it's a fellow Israelite, it is by definition a temporary institution to help the poor, is essentially what it is. All right, it's indentured servitude for people who can't afford to provide themselves, and God has put provisions in place to make sure they get set free, and they have their immediate needs met. All right, they have food, they have shelter, they have a job, essentially, and then after a period of time, no matter how much they owe, they could owe you $50 bazillion, but on that 7th year, you got to set them free anyway, all right? They didn't have dollars back then, but okay, you get the point, all right? 7 years, that's all you get, and they're set free, and you have to provide for them so they don't come back into it again, all right? However, the biggest limitation of everything we've seen, and I got to be honest, and I kind of hope he's watching, there's a gentleman who he hasn't been commenting lately, but then again, I haven't really been able to respond to him because I've been so busy. But there's a skeptical gentleman who does tend to comment a lot on our YouTube channel. And he asked a lot of questions about not just, we have our regular weekly apologetics program every Friday. We have pocket-sized apologetics. For those of you that are interested, it's usually like a 2 to 4 minute, real short apologetics thought. Apologetics, for those that aren't familiar, it's 1 Peter 3:15, always be prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that you have. That word answer in Greek is apologia, which is where we get the word apologetics from. It basically just means being prepared to answer people's questions, all right? Anyway, but this gentleman, he made a comment, because in last year's summer class, which was the Case for Christ class, I did very briefly touch on the issue of slavery. I mean, it really was more of a side note to what we were talking about. And he commented on it, because all I really got to cover was what we've done in this class so far, and even now we've gone more in depth than I did then. I talked about Hebrew slaves, and he quite fairly raised the question: what about foreigners? What about non-Hebrew slaves? So we need to talk about that, and actually I got to thank him for it, because I took a biblical apologetics class in seminary this past spring, and I had to write a term paper on it. And I said, you know what I'm going to write it on? I'm going to write it on foreign chattel slaves in Israel, So I was thinking about for a while giving you guys a copy of my term paper, putting it at the end of the book, but with how hot it is in here, usually I knew that would put you to sleep, so I just summarized it a little bit in the book. All right? So let's talk about foreign slaves a little bit. So we know that God did require Hebrew slaves to be released either after serving 6 years or in the year of Jubilee, but those protections, in all honesty, did not apply to foreigners. Let's take a look at what is probably one of the most disturbing passages for a lot of people when it comes to foreign slaves, Leviticus chapter 25, verses 44 through 46. All right? Can somebody read that one for us, please? It's page 24 of the book. All right, let's do what we always done. Let's face it head on. Let's face it squarely. Let's talk about it. What bothers you most? I bet there's no right answer to this. I'm just curious to get people's feeling. What bothers you most about that passage? Because I know there's stuff in there that bothers you. It bothered me when I read it.
Almost everyone read through in this passage because it's portrayed us.
Yeah, God loves everyone. It doesn't really seem like he's treating everyone equally here, does it? Anything else? What bothered you? In slavery for the whole entire life? Yep, they can be passed on if the master dies first. Anything else anybody wants to share? All right. So, it is a disturbing passage. Now, keep in mind, as we're going to start diving into this, what we already talked about. This is why we talk about the cultural realities first, why I didn't just dive into these passages without covering that first. You've got to understand this was already going on. All right, this is what was going on in the nation at the time. That this is the kind of the hand God was dealt. And so now knowing that he's got this hand dealt to him, the question he's got to ask is, all right, how do I change their hearts? Don't just tell them, don't do X, because they're going to do X anyway. They've proven that time and time again. How do I change their hearts to get them to realize that this is not a good idea? All right, and he mentioned incrementally, all right, was one good example. So let's see what God actually does. We kind of talked about that second question already. All right, first, always look at the surrounding context, all right? Just like we did, I didn't actually put this one on the slide, but this is that basic principle. Remember we talked about, just like we talked about with Abraham. I said when we're reading something about Abraham, we need to know what else the Bible says about Abraham and what he knew. Well, if you're reading the passage about foreign slaves and foreigners in Israel, you got to know what else the Bible says about foreign slaves and foreigners in Israel, all right? To make sure you get the whole picture. So let's look at the general picture, but generally how God said foreigners should be treated in Israel, for starters, all right? Somebody want to read that first passage for us? Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 17 through 18. We're on page 24 of the book here.
Whether slave or free, foreigners were to be treated fairly and with compassion in Israel. Do not deprive the foreigner or the fatherless of justice, or take the cloak of the widow of the slave. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. That is why I command you to do that.
Well, there's something interesting, isn't it? Remember that rationale we just saw a few verses ago about why they should be treating, we were talking about Hebrews and why they should be treating people fairly. We said, what was the rationale? We talked about the rationale being, remember, you were slaves once too. And now we explicitly see that same rationale pop up again, but now it's in relation to foreigners. So we see that they're even under the same circuit. God is saying, remember where you came from. Keeps reminding them of that. Isn't that interesting? Maybe there's a reason for that. God keeps coming back to that. Remember, you were slaves. You were mistreated. How did you want to be treated? All right? You were slaves in a foreign land. How did you want the foreigners to be treating you then? All right, when you were slaves and when you were visitors in their land. And now we see the same thing. God's saying, even as applies to foreigners, you got to treat them nice. You got to treat them fairly. And it's because you got to remember how you wanted to be treated when you were in a foreign land. All right? The next one, this is Leviticus chapter 19, verses 33 and 34. It says, when a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. There it is again. All right? We're bringing it back to still reminding them of what their history was, telling them to remember where they came from. And yet again, saying you've got to treat foreigners kindly. So we may not have arrived at an answer for this passage yet, for that troublesome slavery passage yet. But we know one thing. You can't read it in isolation. You've got to take the big picture. So now we've got these two, but in this time in our minds might be seeming competing types of ideas. And one time God's saying you can have foreign slaves, and another one saying, but you should treat all foreigners nicely and kindly, all right? So at this point, maybe it's just enough of a seed to make us go, what's going on here, all right? All right, now this is an interesting one, and I'm not going to brag on it too much other than to say that when I put this in my term paper, my professor particularly liked this point. All right, so, all right, I think maybe it's in my own original thought, but somebody will probably watch this video from Cleveland, Ohio, and say, no, I put that in my term paper too. But, all right, let's take a look at Genesis chapter 17, verses 12 through 13. This is on page 25 of the book. All right, let somebody read that for me, and then we're going to ask a couple questions about it.
For the generations to come, every male among you who is 18 years old must be circumcised, including those born in your household or lawful sons of one, those who are not your offspring. Whether born in your household or lawful money, they must be circumcised. My covenant is your trust is to you an everlasting covenant.
All right. First of all, this doesn't actually have the word slavery in it, so what is in there that lets you know that this applies to slaves? Whether they're part of your household or whether you bought them. All right, so right there we can see from that language, this is covering, your natural born kids or any slaves that you've bought. Slaves you bought from foreigners. We're talking about foreign slaves here. All right. Now, what does it mean to enter into a covenant?
To enter a relationship.
Oh, I like that word. Perfect. Well, did you read the book before you came here? Yeah. To enter into a relationship. Wait a minute. Do you enter into a relationship with a book, with a box, with something you own, a piece of physical property? No. And yet here we have an example where God is specifically saying he wants to enter into a covenant relationship with slaves that have been bought by foreigners, with foreign slaves. What does that point alone, what does that tell you about the way God viewed them? Did he view them as property, in other words? Human beings, right? People. That's a point that you could easily be glossed over if you read this too quickly. But you look at it, that's actually a huge passage, a huge point in enlightening us on this issue. Right there, we know God recognizes the basic, fundamental humanity and value of everyone because he wants everyone to enter into a covenant relationship with him. You don't do that with a piece of property. All right? All right. So, next issue we're going to look at. Again, we're looking at a lot of different things to kind of create a big picture, all aimed towards understanding this passage about foreign slaves. Let's talk about the way runaway slaves were treated. All right? Somebody escapes their master and gets away. Well, let's look at the surrounding laws, first of all. What was going on in the nations around Israel? According to the Code of Hammurabi, if you harbored a runaway slave, you got killed. You earned the death penalty. You were required to, if you found a runaway slave, you were required to return them to their master, and if you didn't, your life was forfeit. The laws of Ashnuna and the Hittite laws also required that if you found a runaway slave, you also had to return them. They didn't kill you, they just exacted a very heavy financial penalty if you didn't. All right? The whole idea was you had to return them. Let's compare that, shall we? You probably see where this is going already. To Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 15 through 16. Somebody want to read that for us? I have no idea what page we're on right now because I'm reading off the 25. Excellent.
Slaves have taken refuge with you. Do not hand them over to their master. Let them live among you wherever they like and whatever town they choose.
So according to God's law, what were the Israelites supposed to do if they came across a runaway slave? Let them go, protect them. And here's something else that if you don't understand the full context, you might not get. In one sense, God actually gave the escaped slave here more rights than Israelites had. All right? What does it say? It said, let them live among you, and what comes next? Wherever they like in whatever town they choose. Anybody know in ancient Israel, did the Israelites have that right? To go wherever they wanted to in the entire land of Israel and live wherever they wanted to? You ever hear of the 12 tribes of Israel? The land was divided up by tribe. And you had to live in whatever land was allocated to your tribe. An escaped slave didn't. They could go wherever they want. And that makes sense. Because first of all, I think the presumption here is if they're escaping, that master's doing something wrong. All right? That they took off. All right? Because keep in mind, again, lots of times, even with foreigners, lots of times the slavery was a matter of economic need. All right? So if you got somebody who can't provide for themselves and in either goes into debt slavery or chattel slavery because of that, and even then they give all that up, they give up that security, that probably means that we've got an abusive master on our hands. We don't want to return that person to us. And you probably, if you're that slave, probably don't want to settle down anywhere in the same tribal area as your former master, because they probably have a lot of connections, family, friends, that might not see things the same way and might turn you back over. So this is actually allowing the slave the freedom to go elsewhere, start a new life wherever they want to go in the land of Israel. Stark contrast to what we see in the surrounding nations. So what you're starting hopefully to get a picture of is the reason I'm contrasting this with what's going on in surrounding nations, because understand, but for God's intervention, those are the types of laws you would have been seeing in Israel. All right? That's what the Israelites were used to. And so what we see here is God saying, you're not going to be like the surrounding nations when it comes to this issue. All right? You're going to do this instead. If you got an escaped slave, you're going to protect them, all right, and set them up wherever they want to be set up. All right. Moving on to, this is the top of page 26, still talking about the treatment of runaway slaves, and now specifically the slave trade. All right, look at what this passage says here in 21:16 of Exodus. It says, anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession. So here again, we have a passage that doesn't specifically mention slavery, but how do you know it deals with slavery? Sold. It talks about kidnapping someone and selling them. If an Israelite were to engage in that practice, what happens to them? They get punished how? They get put to death. The death penalty. Ladies and gentlemen, that was the American slave trade. That's what happened. All right? These slave traders would go, they would kidnap people, and they would bring them back, and they would sell them into slavery. All right? God is very clear. That ain't going to happen. And if you do it, you die. All right? This is where I say we have to be very careful not to bring our 21st century cultural presuppositions into this text. What was going on back then is not what we're used to. Now, the reason God has to enact a law like this is because it was happening in the surrounding nations. All right? But this is another example where God's chipping away at that and saying, what they're doing, you're not going to do. All right. Yeah. If someone, the laws that we see in Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and we're going to get to this in a few slides, are what are called case law. All right? They're examples, they're illustrations. You'll see this more clearly later on. And so what would happen is an Israelite judge, let's say that happens, where somebody kidnaps a person and they sell them. And so the question then, well, what about the person that bought them? Now, if this is the only law this person has to deal with and the judge has to look at, they're going to have to look at this and say, okay, well, I understand in this scenario this is what happens, and extrapolate from that what should happen in that circumstance. I think at a minimum, it becomes abundantly clear that that person is freed immediately because they shouldn't have been put in slavery in the first place. The question you're asking is what happens to the person that bought them? And I think that would go to accessory type of mentality. Did they know that the person was kidnapped at the time they bought them? If they did, then I'd say they're just as guilty of breaking this law as the person who did the initial kidnapping. That's a concept we see even in our law today. If they didn't know, well, then maybe they don't get personally punished, but they do have to free the person. And frankly, the money's probably forfeit because they're never getting it back from this person, most likely. And that's just somewhat of a guess, but that's kind of how it would work. You take this law, and then you'd have to try to apply it to the scenario and extrapolate from it. All right, so that being said, let's revisit this passage we looked at the very beginning of the class, Exodus 21, chapters 20 through 21, now that we have kind of this background information, all right? And let's take a look at it in more detail. It said, and this is again still from the New Revised Standard Version. It says, when a slave owner strikes a male or female slave with a rod, and the slave dies immediately, the owner shall be punished. But if the slave survives a day or two, there is no punishment, for the slave is the owner's property. Like we said, on first reading, this looks like it's kind of divided up into two parts, right? There's, number one, what happens if the slave dies immediately? Well, then the owner is punished in some way, shape, or form. If the slave survives a day or two, you keep him alive, you keep him kicking, and they die on day 3, you're off the hook, all right? And then there's that statement at the end, because the slave is the owner's property, which right off the bat, we should be starting to be suspicious that maybe we're bringing something in our 21st century understanding to that. Why? What have we already learned? And just in the context that we've already looked at, we specifically addressed whether God views slaves as just some material thing. Do you remember what passage we looked at that covered that? Yeah, which said what?
Which says that you're entering a covenant with them.
Right, so we already know that whatever this passage means, it can't mean what we're thinking it means, because that would be inconsistent with God entering into a covenant with them, right? So there's something more going on. That alone should set us a light off. There might be something wrong, maybe with a translation, maybe with our understanding here 2,000 years later, or whatever is going on, all right? So let's take a look at this. First thing, remember I told you I'm sorry.
Is the timing in which Genesis and Exodus were written around the same time, or is there a gap in timing? I believe Genesis was around the 6th and 5th century. Exodus, was it at the same time or a span of years difference?
Okay, as far as the writing of the books, they're going to be relatively close in time, because at least traditionally the authorship of both is attributed to Moses. All right, so Moses wrote the books. The narratives they convey do flow right into each other. I mean, if you look at the end of Genesis, the beginning of Exodus picks up right where it left off. That being said, there are gaps within Genesis, large jumps in time, so to speak. I mean, clearly Moses there is writing things that have been relayed to him by God, the Holy Spirit, whatever, because there's things in there that he wasn't alive to witness. Moses was not around with Adam and Eve were around, obviously. So there are some gaps in there, and it's relaying something that took spanned a much greater period of time. But as far as when it was actually written down, at least the traditional understanding of it'd be relatively close in time within the span of Moses' lifetime.
I know you said something about context being taken into consideration. I was wondering if there was a different context with what was written in Genesis. Maybe it was 100 years earlier than what was written in Exodus, which was 100.
Yes, and there will be, because to some extent, nothing really I think that's necessarily applying here to what we're talking about tonight, but to give you an example, you look at the context of the events, for example, that it's describing, and if you know anything about like Abraham, at the time of Abraham, he was living a very nomadic lifestyle. He was in one land, and God said, go travel to this land. And they kind of moved around with their herds. When one field got eaten up, they'd move on to the next one. So lifestyle was very different. And then by the time you get to Exodus, you've got major Egyptian cities and everything like that. So yes, there is going to be some cultural differences. Now, whether or not those cultural differences will make a difference in what we're talking about, that's going to vary depending on the passage we're talking about. But yes, there will be some differences. All right, so specifically in this troublesome passage, the first, we're going to kind of go back and forth, you'll see here, between the basic principle 5 and basic principle 3 as we're talking about this. First point I want to make has to do with principle 5. And in case you're wondering, why are you going back and forth between the basic principles? Because I'm doing it in order of the passage. So we're talking about that first part, and then the second part, and then the property part, kind of working our way through the passage. Basic principle 5 said, Sometimes our failure to understand a difficult passage is because we are missing some nuance from the original language or the historical cultural context in which the action takes place. What we saw in that New Revised Standard Version, in that first part, it said that if the slave dies immediately, then the owner is punished. All right? Not a great translation, because remember one of the things I said at the beginning of the class, well, does that mean he's just given a 1 cent fine and set on his way? No, it does not. That Hebrew word that they translate as punished elsewhere is translated avenged. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the avenger of blood and this whole concept that runs throughout the Old Testament, but that term almost always means the death penalty. All right, that's what it's used in the context of. So really what we're talking about, and most scholars will agree with this, is that term punished. If the slave dies right away, so does the owner. They're given it's not just any minor punishment, it's the death penalty. That in and of itself, even without going any further through this passage, do you have any idea how unfathomable that is compared to the surrounding nations? Again, we have another instance where God is affirming the basic humanity of everyone, a life for a life. All right? You didn't just destroy property, you destroyed a life. Therefore, your life is forfeit. All right? That in and of itself was an astounding difference with what was going on in the surrounding nations. All right. The third basic principle said always make sure we take in the entire surrounding textual context before coming to a conclusion. This one's going to take a little longer to explain. But the question becomes, all right, so we see in part 1, what we understand now is God said if the slave dies right away, it's the death penalty, just like it is for anybody else. All right? But then we get to that second part, and we say, but wait a minute. But the second part seems to say you just keep them alive for a couple of days, and you're off scot-free. Well, is that really what it says? This, again, we need to look at the surrounding textual context. So, what's that? Well, is it? That's where one common scholarly explanation of what's going on here is they try to say, and I'll be upfront with you, I don't agree with this, all right, but I'm going to present it to you because it's out there, all right? I don't agree with it. I'll explain to you why I don't agree with it. But the idea is that the first half, if the slave dies right away, that it's very clear that the owner intended to kill them, the master, I should say, intended to kill them, all right? Therefore, they get the death penalty. But if they don't die right away, then, maybe we don't know for sure whether they actually had the intent to kill, because obviously the injuries weren't severe enough to kill them right away, all right? And so we don't punish them. Really, what this interpretation would say, we don't punish them at all because they didn't intend to kill, all right? That's the idea behind it. And it is very common. A lot of people will tell you that's what's going on here. I don't agree with it, and I'll tell you why. Because if that was the case, again, looking at the surrounding textual context, we should see parallels, all right? If there's anywhere else in Scripture where God makes a distinction between intentional killing and unintentional killing, then we should look to see if they line up, all right? If the way God's treating intentional versus unintentional is the same in both circumstances or not. Hint, it's not, all right? And this is what we're getting at here with the first passages from Numbers chapter 35, verses 20 through 21, all right? Take a look. Somebody read that for me. It's on page 27 of the book, the first quote there on page 27.
Likewise, if someone pushes another from hatred or hurls something at another, blinding way, and death ensues, or in enmity strikes another with the hand, and death ensues, then the one who struck the blow shall be put to death. That person is a murderer. The avenger of blood shall put the murderer to death when they meet.
All right. Well, first of all, you see this is another example. Remember I told you earlier that Hebrew word that usually was translated punish, usually means avenge, is usually referred to as used in the context of the death penalty. Here's an example where exactly that's happened. The avenger of blood, it's the death penalty. All right. What we see here is an example where someone you can't be cold. Are you really? You're putting on, oh, you're right beneath the vent. Let's switch places. You come up and teach the rest of the class. I'll sit there because it's hot up here. All right. So here we see an example where, remember, what we're looking at here is, let's see if there's an example where God makes a distinction between intentional and unintentional killing, all right? Here we see an example of intentional killing, and what's the punishment for it? Death penalty, right? We're good so far, right? If the distinction is intentional versus unintentional, at least on the intentional part, we have a parallel, all right? But let's keep reading. This is now, I'll read that bottom quote because that's a lot longer, all right? It says, but if someone pushes another suddenly without enmity, unintentional, all right? Or hurls any object without lying in wait, or while handling any stone that could cause death, unintentionally drops it on another and death ensues, though they were not enemies and no harm was intended. I mean, if you hadn't gotten the point, this is unintentional. I mean, they're really hammering it home here, right? All right. Then the congregation shall send the slayer back to the original city of refuge. The slayer shall live in it until the death of the high priest who was anointed with the holy oil. But if the slayer shall at any time go outside the bounds of the original city of refuge, and is found by the avenger of blood outside the bounds of the city of refuge, and is killed by the avenger, no blood guilt shall be incurred. For the slayer must remain in the city of refuge until the death of the high priest. But after the death of the high priest, the slayer may return home. All right. You can catch all that. Essentially what God did is he set up a system for manslaughter, for lack of a better word, unintentional killing, where there were certain cities in Israel where if you committed manslaughter, you could go and live and not be killed, all right? But the trade-off was you had to stay in that city, all right? Your punishment was you didn't have freedom of movement anymore, all right? You had to stay there. If you did leave, you could be killed, all right? That's what we see in unintentional killing, is that if the original passage was making a distinction between intentional and unintentional, does this match up with the second part? Is there any mention in that original Exodus passage about a city of refuge? But none of that's in there, all right? So this is part of the reason why I don't think that's what's going on in that original passage, because I don't think that we should expect to see God treating the greater offense the same way, but not the lesser one, you know? So if that's not what's going on, then what is going on? What is the distinction between these two? And this gets back again to principle number 5. Sometimes our failure to understand a difficult passage is because we're missing some nuance from the original language, all right? That word, and now you're going to see why I gave you the New Revised Standard Version and not my standard NIV, because there's no... The best Bible translation is all of them, you know, is to look at multiple ones. The best one is the original language, but that's why you get a good commentary. So by no means am I saying that the NIV is superior to the New Revised Standard. No, I'm not. But in this particular instance, it does do a better job of it. Here's why. That word that was translated survives in the New Revised Standard Version, which gave us the impression that all it was talking about was you keep them alive for 2 days, and then if they die, you're good, all right? Literally speaking, it actually translates to he stands, which is generally used to refer to recovery. They get better, all right? And this is how it is translated in the New International Version. Anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished, which we've already know is the death penalty, if the slave dies as a direct result. But they are not to be punished, they're not to be killed by death penalty, if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. All right? So what we see right now is essentially, at least for parts 1 and 2, we'll get to the property statement in a minute. But part 1 and 2, what this is saying is if they die, then the person who, the owner gets executed. If they don't die, the owner doesn't get executed. That's perfectly reasonable. All right? That's what's being said so far. And again, let's talk about context. All right, remember what we just did before to say, hey, is there any parallels, any parallel verses? And we said if it was intentional versus unintentional, the parallel verses don't really match up. What about in this situation where I'm suggesting that it's really talking about, the first part being if they die, and the second part being if they fully recover. Well, lo and behold, The verses immediately before this, I mean literally right before this passage in Exodus, all you got to do is read 2 verses earlier. If people quarrel and one person hits another with a stone or with their fist, and the victim does not die but is confined to bed, the one who struck the blow will not be held liable if the other can get up and walk around outside with a staff. However, the guilty party must pay the injured person for any loss of time and see that the victim is completely healed. Literally right before the passage we're reading, it's making this exact same distinction that I'm talking about. All right? What you see here is 2 back-to-back instances where God is setting forth the same policy for slave and non-slave. Back-to-back. All right? Exactly the same. So that's what's really going on here. It's saying, if you kill someone, you die. If they don't die, you don't die. All right? But then we get to that last phrase. All right? So what the heck does that mean, since the slave is their property? Well, remember again the context. What did we just see in the verses right before this? It didn't just say you don't die. It said you have to take care of them, right? You have to provide for them. You have to make sure they recover. What did we already say the nature of this slave-master relationship required of the master in the very beginning? They had to take care of him, right? So at least what some scholars propose, and this is what I tend to agree with, is this, and we already know that whatever is going on here can't mean the slave is literally their property in this way we think of it in the 21st century, because that doesn't make any sense if God wanted to enter into a covenant with them, all right? What really this is saying, which, like I said, which I personally think, and a lot of scholars do agree with me, is this is basically reminding people, you got to take care of them. Because you're in this master-slave relationship, if you injure them, even if they recover, you're responsible for making sure they get better. So really what this passage has seemed very, very troublesome at first, if we understand it in its cultural context, we understand the original languages and what's going on, what we see is what it's really saying is if a master kills a slave, the master gets the death penalty. If the master doesn't kill the slave, the master doesn't get the death penalty, but they are responsible for making sure that that slave recovers. Now all of a sudden it doesn't seem so bad, does it? I mean, we still may not agree with everything that's going on here, and you're probably not going to. I mean, I know when I read that, I still say, okay, but they still need to be punished somewhat, right? Well, we'll get to that. There's more coming. But at a minimum, it's not what we originally thought it was. Is that rain? Wow. All right. All right, so let's talk about that. Let's say, well, wait a minute, Ken. But still, that's, the master injures somebody. They're still just, that's letting them get off the hook. They got to make sure they get better. But that's all that happens to them, really? No. Again, you don't read things in isolation. Exodus chapter 21, verses 26 through 27. An owner who hits a male or female slave in the eye and destroys it must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye. And an owner who knocks out the tooth of a male or female slave must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth. Wow, people, it's funny when people object to it and they try to say that God condones slavery, they don't bring this verse up too much, And this is what we were talking about before when I mentioned case law. Understand, this is an example of case law. It's giving you examples. Now, does this mean that if the master happens to cause some injury so that a slave loses a finger, that they're going to go to court and the judge is going to say, well, if it was an eye or a tooth, you'd be golden, but it's a finger, so you're stuck? No. Okay, that's case law is meant to be illustrative. So the judge is going to apply these examples that God's giving to the specific facts of their particular case. And so what we're seeing here is any kind of injury severe enough to be, I guess, reasonably permanent. I mean, losing a tooth, they didn't have not crowns. Crowns go in, you still have a base. Is it a crown? What's the root? I shouldn't say this on video. My wife needs one. She just had to have a tooth pulled. The replacement tooth, Implant, yeah. I mean, they didn't have those back then, okay? But literally something as I don't want to say too minor, but you lose a tooth, you're free. The master's got to let you go. So understand the big picture. That original passage that we saw doesn't stand in isolation. It's if you kill them, you're dead. You get executed. If you don't kill them, you don't die, but you're responsible for taking care of them. And oh, by the way, if you did so much as just knock out a tooth, you got to let them go. All right? Full context. All right? Now, this is really interesting. This question I have at the bottom of the screen here. Think through the implications of that. And this is, again, I'll tell you why. This is not just me making something up because it's convenient for me. How do you think a master would ever be brought before a judge in the first place with someone complaining that they knocked a slave's tooth out? Who's going to bring that case against them? You're all bringing 21st century assumptions into it because you're all thinking the answer is the slave, but nobody wants to say it. If they know. If they know, again, if all you see is someone walking down the street with a missing tooth, how are you going to know it's because the master punched him in the face? Who's the primary witness for that? The slave, right? Implicitly in this, it's giving the slave the right to bring the master to court. And if you don't believe me, look at Job 31:14 when you get home. You know what Job says there? He specifically talks about the fact that he always treated his servants fairly when they brought him to court. So Job is acknowledging that God gave them the right, gave the slaves the right to bring their masters to court and complain. Find me that in any surrounding nation's laws. You ain't going to. All right? So, quick summary, then we're going to move on to one last point, all right, about the New Testament. But I like to do this because sometimes when you kind of work your way incrementally through things, you kind of lose track of the big picture. And so I want to take a look at everything we just talked about since the beginning of the class. How did God treat slaves? Well, he provided several mechanisms for automatic freedom for Hebrew slaves. He acknowledged the basic fundamental humanity of everyone, including slaves, foreign and Hebrew. He welcomed them into his covenant. He mandated protection for runaway slaves. He banned kidnapping and the slave trade. He protected them against abuse, even imposing the death penalty on masters, and mandated freedom for less severe injuries. And he gave them the right to take their master to court. Does that sound like a God who thought that what we had here as antebellum slavery, for example, in the United States, was a perfectly fine thing? No. We talked at the beginning about God playing the long game. So what he does, and I think the most fundamental one there is recognizing their basic humanity. And it's kind of related to the covenant. We saw those, that kind of came out together. But the fact that God acknowledged everyone is equal. Everyone has certain human rights. All right? That's the seed he needed to plant to change their hearts in the long run. Everything else he's doing is helping reinforce that point. All right? That you need to start looking at people differently. All right? One last objection, and that's the Apostle Paul. All right. Some people will look at the New Testament, specifically the book of Philemon, and they will claim that Paul condoned slavery. Real short book. It's one chapter. I mean, you don't even have, if you look at the citations like down the bottom, you'll see like Philemon 16. That's because there is no chapter 1, chapter 2. It's just one thing. It's a real short letter. But what's going on in this letter is Paul has come across this slave, Onesimus, all right, who is a Christian, and he is writing a letter for Onesimus to take back with him as Onesimus is returning to his master, Philemon. Well, lo and behold, Philemon is also a Christian, all right? And so some people look at this, and they understand, again, the cultural context of the time. Roman law did require that if you came across a runaway slave, you were supposed to return them to their owner, all right? So a lot of people look at this book and they say, isn't Paul just giving into Roman law? I mean, here he is returning a slave to his master. All right? Isn't that a problem? Well, is that really what's going on in this book? Again, let's talk about context first of all. And the first one is a very famous passage from the book of Galatians, chapter 3, verses 28. This is Paul writing now. All right? Somebody want to read that one for us? You probably heard it before. This is one of my favorite passages in the Bible Because, I mean, if you ever want to know how God thinks about all of us, there you go. In the eyes of Christ, we're all the same. All right? The same man that people are accusing of condoning slavery is the man who wrote that passage, who specifically says there is no slave or free. There's no difference between them. All right? So that alone, even before we look at the book of Philemon, that alone should tip you off. There's something else going on here, kind of like that covenant passage where we saw God saying, I want to welcome slaves into the covenant. Tells you there's something more going on here. So what does Paul say in the book of Philemon? Does he send Onesimus back to Philemon? Yes, he does. Does he send him back as a slave to a master? No. What he actually says is, I want you to take him back, Philemon, no longer as a slave, but better than a slave, as a dear brother. And in case Philemon still didn't get the point, he said, welcome him as you would welcome me. Do you understand how amazing what Paul just did there is? He puts Onesimus on the same level as Paul the Apostle. All right? If you didn't think he believed what he said in Galatians, there's your number one piece of evidence. All right? There's no difference. Philemon, if I showed up at your house, I meaning Paul the Apostle, if I showed up at your house, however you would treat me when I came to your house, that's how I expect you to treat Onesimus when he returns. Just like we see in the Old Testament, where God was radically challenging, all right, the institution of slavery as it existed at the time, Paul's doing the exact same thing. But people, unfortunately, when they read the Bible, tend to ignore the historical, the cultural, the textual context of what's going on in these passages. It's kind of a lazy reading. You just want to read these few verses and think you're going to get the answer right out of that. You're not going to get the answer right out of that. Get a study Bible. Get a commentary. Do the work. If there's something that's really bothering you, don't be lazy about it. Send me an email. I don't mind it. You know, I might not be able to get back to you right away, but I will get back to you. All right? All right. What we've seen throughout this entire class is when it came to the issue of slavery, God plays the long game. We could institute this as one of our basic principles, but the mere fact that God permitted slavery to exist does not mean he approved of it. That's the same thing we saw in that passage from Matthew, which is put back up on the screen again. It's the same one we read earlier tonight. Jesus talking about divorce. Jesus very clearly declared that yes, God permitted divorce, but that doesn't mean he approved of it. God permitted slavery, but he very clearly didn't approve of it because he took steps to get rid of it. All right? The hearts of the Israelites were hard, just like they were hard on the issue of divorce. So God permitted slavery to continue, but he laid down principles that would lead to recognizing the fundamental humanity of everyone, and that was going to be more effective in the long run in changing people's hearts than any fiat he could give. As a matter of fact, if you were to look at history and the abolition of slavery in America and in Great Britain, a lot of the same arguments that you heard me make tonight were the exact same arguments that contributed to those causes. All right. It was these scriptures that we talked about, that we worked our way through, which is what helped contribute to the end of slavery in those countries. Now, does that mean that there's not still work to be done? Sure there is. Slavery still exists today, folks. It does. All right. You come across it, though, hopefully now you're feeling a little bit better equipped to respond to anybody who tries to say that they're doing it because God approved of it. No, he didn't. All right. Anybody have any questions about anything? All right. Next week, genocide. There's an intro for you, huh? All right. Thank you, everybody.